Hi guys, this is day 26 of the A2 Economics Revision Challenge, and today we are doing a video on long run cost. When we look at production in the long run or cost in the long run, we are looking at a situation where in the long run there are no fixed costs because there are no fixed inputs. Remember, the fixed inputs result in fixed costs and the variable inputs result in variable costs. Because in the long run there is no fixed input, we also say this, that in the long run there are no fixed costs, and therefore all the costs are variable in the long run for a firm. So that's one thing we need to remember when we're looking at long run. Now in the long run, the firm has basically two options. So let me write this. The long run, the firm has two options. Either they can choose the scale of production, and I'm going to explain this in 1 minute. Scale of production, or they can choose the factor mix. So let me write this: choose the factor mix. So these are the two options that are available for a firm in the long run. So what do we mean by scale of production versus what do we mean by choosing the factor mix? Choosing the factor mix is simply the idea that the firm can select any kind of combination of land, labor, capital and enterprise. So if you read this, we suggest that the firm can select the mix of factors it wishes to use. For example, any combination of labor, capital and other factors of production, because all factors of production are variable, so we can just choose any factor mix as we want. While choosing the scale of production is simply basically changing the scale, and scale means changing, let me write this, changing all inputs in equal proportion. So when we can change all inputs in equal proportion, for example, doubling all inputs or increasing our inputs by 75% or increasing it by 10% or even reducing that, that's basically changing what we call scale of production. So the first, choosing the factor mix, you can have any combination of land, labor, capital, enterprise, versus in the scale of production I can choose the scale, which means I can change them in an equal proportion. It could be 50%, 20% and so on and so forth. So when we change the scale of production, that's an important thing to understand. There are three things that can come about. When we change the factor of the scale of production, we are increasing or decreasing all inputs in a given proportion, then three things can happen. Number one is your constant returns to scale. Number two is your increasing returns to scale, and number three is our decreasing returns to scale. So what is constant returns to scale? Well, we say this constant returns to scale is when where a given percentage increase in input, let's say double input, we double our input and that leads to the same percentage increase in output, which means basically double output. So you double all your inputs, and as a result what you found out, your output also doubled at the same time. Now if that is the case, if you have a constant returns to scale, then one would argue this, that the average cost or long run average cost will be constant. Why? Because doubled your input, doubled your output, the cost doubled, the output also doubled, so long run average cost curve will not change. On the other hand, when you have increasing returns to scale, this is where a given percentage increase in input will lead to a larger percentage increase in output, which means that you double input, for example, your output, basically output more than doubles. And if output more than doubles, that basically means that LRAC falls, right? So I'm going to, in this case, we are basically finding what we also say sometimes, economies of scale to happen. Economies of scale basically by definition mean it is changing the scale of production, having a lower average cost. So long run average cost falls means we are achieving economies of scale to happen. On the other hand, the last case is where we have decreasing returns to scale. In the case of decreasing returns to scale, this is where a given percentage increase in inputs, let's say double your input, we double our input, and what if your output increases by less than double. Let's say double means 100%, let's say by 50%, for example. This is where we will see that the LRAC will realize this, that the LRAC is actually going to be rising. So LRAC rises. Why? Because your cost per unit is rising. Why? Because input were doubled, so cost doubled, but the output did not increase by that same percentage. And that's basically where you have what we call diseconomies of scale. So that's basically three things that can happen. Now, if I quickly recap what we've done, is just that, so three scenarios can come about when you are doubling your input. For example, when you double input, your output also double. That's where LRAC is constant, which is what we call constant returns to scale. Or you double your inputs and output more than double. This is where basically cost per unit will be falling, and that's where LRAC falls. And that's a great scenario. It's called economies of scale. Remember, scale, economies of scale means this is a long-term scenario. Similarly, you double your inputs and your output also increases, but by less than 100% or increases by less than double, we say LRAC is rising. This means that cost per unit is rising or diseconomies of scale is happening. Now, understand this, in the long run, I can change all my inputs in any combination that I want to, and in the case of changing the scale, I'm changing them in equal proportion. But then comes this other option of changing the factor mix. When we change the factor mix, basically what we're trying to do is find the combination that can be least costly combination, the one that gives you the maximum possible output for a given level of input. So for example, I have a combination of inputs in the long run. What can be the maximum possible output that I can get from that? If I am able to get the maximum possible output from a given combination, basically that's where my cost per unit will be the lowest. So how do we get that least least cost combination? We say that this is achieved through what we call the Equis marginal principle, where MPL over price of L is equal to MPK over price of K is equal to any MP of N over price of N. What do we mean by this? This is what we call Equis marginal principle, which says this, that the marginal product per dollar spent, let me write this, MP per dollar spent must be same for all inputs. If MP per dollar spent is same for all inputs, we are basically getting ourselves a situation where we have actually maximize our output from a given level of input or minimize our cost for a given level of output. So in other words, when the extra product or output per dollar spent from the last pound spent or from the last dollar spent on each factor is equal, I do not need to substitute to another factor of production because I've maximized my output per dollar spent. Let's assume that if they were not equal, and so what would you do? And let's say you have a situation, and let's just run this situation here. Let's say you have a situation where MPK, or rather MPL over price of L, is greater than MPK over price of K. So let's say MPL is, for example, 50, and let's say MPK is, for example, 20. So, and let's say price of L is for example $10, and price of K is also, for example, $10. So let's say prices are the same, and labor gives us more per dollar spent than capital. So what should I do now? Well, the answer is that if I look at MPL over price of L, right now that is 50 over 10, which is 5, while MPK over price of K, that is 20 over 10, that's 2. Clearly I should have more labor and less capital. So whenever MPL over price of L, for example, is greater than MPK over price of K, the firm will do this. The firm will start to substitute because the equi-marginal principle is not met. Lay capital gives you $2 per dollar, 2 units per dollar spent, while labor gives you, as per our example, $5 per unit per dollar spent. So what do? You buy more of labor, but you should buy less of capital from your given budget. You should become more labor intensive and less capital intensive. So what am I doing? I'm increasing capital and reducing capital and increasing labor, which means every labor will now start to get less and less of capital to work with, while every capital will now get more and more of labor to work with. So the way we are now sort of utilizing our labor will be such that labor's marginal product will start to fall. Why? Because it's getting less and less of capital to work with, while the capital productivity or MPK will start to rise because it gets more and more of labor to work with. So suddenly when I substitute, because this side was larger than this side, the left hand side was greater than the right hand side, I get more because per dollar spent it's more than capital. I am now going to substitute more labor to capital, but that results in the law of diminishing return kind of a case where the capital to labor ratio starts to fall. In this case, labor is going up and capital is going down because both are sort of changing, and that results in this left hand side to start to fall. But I keep on substituting as left hand side is going down and the right hand side is going up. So this side is going down, this side is going up as I keep on substituting, but there will come a point where MPK over price of K will become equal to MPL over price of L. And if that happens, we say there is no more need for substitution because our equi-marginal principle is met. At this point, we say a firm is basically productively efficient. This is where the firm has found a combination, which is what we call the least cost combination, which is where the LRAC is at its lowest, or we are not LRAC at its lowest, but actually cost per unit is at the minimum for that combination, for that output level. Makes sense? So that's basically what we call equi-marginal principle, which is where this principle has to hold true. And we wrote this here that when the equi-marginal principle is met, this is the point the firm will stop substituting labor for capital. Since no further gain can be made by substituting one factor for another, this combination of factor choice is the one that is the most efficient. So that's the discussion about the two choices. Now here I'm going to move on to talk about the long run cost curves. The long run cost curve is basically can take various sort of shapes, but the one that I want to draw is the one that is below. Let's draw that curve. So the typical shape of LRAC is the one that I'm going to draw. In fact, I want to put the two common cases that are normally seen. The one is this one where you could have a case like a U-shaped curve, which is the LRAC is U-shaped. Here what we say is that this is basically when LRAC is falling, you have economies of scale. Then you have LRAC is rising, which is called diseconomies of scale. So there could be that kind of a shape where this is your quantity of output, and on my sort of y-axis I have cost per unit, but then there is another shape that I want to draw, which is the one that can also have what we call constant returns to scale happening. So it's falling LRAC and then flat and then rising LRAC. That could be another shape that is out there. So this is what you call economies of scale. Then you have constant returns to scale, and then we have what we call diseconomies of scale that takes place. So this is called diseconomies of scale. So that's your cost, the quantity, and this is your cost per unit. So guys, what we say, and I want to show two shapes that are out there. So it's normally assumed that the firm, as it expands, it will initially experience economies of scale and then have a sort of LRAC that is going down, but after some point all such economies of scale that we have sort of achieved will sort of end, and the curve will flatten out. So we have a curve that is flattening out here. As you can see that there's a flat curve here, which is LRAC that is flat because of the constant returns to scale. It could be just for a point, like here this is just a point, while it could be a zone depending on the kind of situation we are in. And then there comes what we call a possibility of diseconomies of scale, for which the major reason of diseconomies of scale, which is the rising LRAC, is that the organization has become a giant, and there is what we call, the biggest reason is what we call managerial diseconomies of scale that can happen. So that's one thing which we need to understand. Now, one more thing that I want to talk about, because that comes a lot in MCQ, is this: what are the assumptions that we are making when we're drawing a particular LRAC curve? Well, number one is this, that at each level of output, we're assuming that a firm will be faced with a given set of prices, that the given set of prices are not changing. But if we change those given set of prices, then the whole LRAC can shift. So we are assuming when we're drawing a particular LRAC that all the prices are constant. Let's say suddenly input prices start to fall for all level of output, LRAC may shift downward. So that's one thing we need to understand. This curve is drawn, LRAC naught is assuming that the prices are constant. Also, when you're drawing LRAC naught, we're also assuming that the state of technology and factor quality is also given. That's also not changing, because that changes, the LRAC will again shift sort of downward. And the third thing we need to remember is this, that the firm chooses the least cost combination, which means that the Equis marginal principle, let me write this, Equis marginal principle holds true. So we need to remember that as well. So when we're drawing LRAC, we are assuming, number one, the factor cost is not changing, the technology is not changing, the technology and factor quality is not changing. But that's where we need to understand this, that when you look at internal economies of scale will mean there is a movement along the LRAC. And I'm not going to get into the details of what are various economies of scale within internal, such as financial, such as managerial and all that. That's an easy discussion. But I want to talk about is that if there is an internal economies of scale, this means the firm is increasing the size of its operation. That's why it's moving from, let's say, point A to B. From A to B, I'm looking at internal economies of scale. But what if the whole curve shifts downward? That could be because of, let's say, what we say, external economies of scale. Why will that happen? Well, external economies of scale happens if the whole industry sort of grows in size, so that for all level of output, suddenly your cost goes down. Let's say government decides to build infrastructure, which helps the cost per unit to go down for all schools or all industries that are out there. That's where the LRAC will be shifting downward. So external economies of scale is something that affects the whole industry, and that's why it's a shift of the curve, of the LRAC curve, while internal is when the firm is growing from within, and that's basically a movement along the LRAC curve. So that's the discussion about long run that we wanted to have today. The most important concept is the Equis marginal principle. which basically is all about making sure that the marginal product per dollar spent must be same for all goods.